Haiti was in the spirit of Angela Frida. So that was great. But I didn't know Leah. And then we happened to drink in a pub in Hackney, which I just have to big up the Samuel Pepys, which was the best pub in Hackney Central back in the day. And I went in and Leah was there and I'd seen her and I was like, oh my God, you're the person who did Voodoo Nation, wow. So we became friends and we became friends since then. So after that, I was at the time working closely with an artist group, which some of you we've talked about in sessions, which is this group called Orphan Drift. And Orphan Drift, well, there are many people, but primarily Maggie Mae Roberts and Ranu Mukherjee. And shortly after that, Leah went to Haiti with Ranu and Maggie, and they ended up making a film called Lineaments of the Loire, which is amazing work, which is probably on the Orphan Drift website if you want to follow that work up. Leah then did a project called Smells Like Voodoo Spirit. We see we have a Nirvana t-shirt in the room, so you'll get what that's about. At the October Gallery in London, and Leah invited me to speak. And I gave a talk about the voodoo construct, which is how voodoo has been misrepresented in popular culture. And there were certain iconic elements that were part of that misrepresentation. And that eventually led to the book that I wrote in 2017 called Undead Uprising, Haiti Horror and the Zombie Complex, which wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Leah. So thanks, Leah. In 2006, Leah went to Haiti looking for artists for a commission for the Museum of Slavery in Liverpool. And during that research trip, she met a group of artists called Artistes Resistance, who I'm sure we'll hear something about. And she commissioned Artistes Resistance to make a sculpture for the Museum of Slavery in Liverpool. In around 2007, Leah then has been collaborating with Artistes Resistance since then. They came up with the idea of doing something called the Ghetto Biennale, which was the idea, basically, to cut a long story short, was that many of the Haitian artists actually couldn't travel out of their country because they couldn't get visas, couldn't get passports.
Thing.
What's that?
Yeah, it's a class thing.
It's a class issue, right?
Yeah.
Like a global class issue. Mm. Whereas internationally, the kind of the idea of the global, art citizen who could travel from Biennale to Biennale all around the world without thinking about it, just jump on a jet. That was something that wasn't happening for people from Haiti. So the idea was to sort of invert that model and get international artists to go and work in Haiti, in Grand Rue, in a place where Artistes Resistance lived and worked. And it's been going on since 2009, and the next one is just coming up. So that's the beginning of Ghetto Biennale, which is how we worked together on that off and on for many years. In 2010, Leah published a great book called Carnival, which I think you'll be mentioning, has just been republished, which is a photographic documentation of Haitian Carnival, which is Leah is a photographer, brilliant photographer, and that's like your first craft, right, photography. So, and she then went on to do a series of portraits called Cast, playing on the cast of characters and also the caste system in Haiti, and this very complex system of racial combinations that Haitian society and culture was divided into during the plantation slavery era. And that led in turn to a project about the relationship around the Liverpool-Manchester ship canal, about the history of industrialization in Great Britain and the history of plantation slavery in the Caribbean. And Leah's from Ellesmere Port. I found out that's very, very important. It's on the Manchester-Liverpool ship canal. So since then, Leah has been developing this research around the relationship between parallel histories, as you call it, between the Enclosures Act in the UK, by which the peasants were forced off the land, which eventually led to the creation of the British working class, and the history of plantation slavery. And they're completely intertwined histories. And so that's where we're at. I'll finally say that Leah is working on a current project with Annabelle Edwards, who's in the audience, hi Annabelle, called Monument to the Vanquished, which is a project which is in development with Meadow Arts. So without any further ado, Leah Gordon.
All right, well, thank you everybody for coming here. So thank you to Meadow Arts and thank you to University of Worcester. And as John said, next year, Annabelle and I are going to be collaborating with Meadow Arts on this kind of project about the Enclosure Act. And the Enclosure Act seems has always seemed to me this thing that's been very much forgotten in history. And it's so instrumental in actually, I think, the way in which we live our lives now. But it's kind of been forgotten. And it's also, I think it's interesting that it hasn't been monumentalized. I mean, and that's kind of one of the sort of issues. So when I was kind of thinking about what I was going to talk about today, I was thinking about how you retell history, you know, and how kind of like problematic that can be, and how charged, and the tensions of kind of what history is, who tells history. So, and I love this quote because I just discovered this quote. And as artists, of course, there's so many artists that kind of speculate about history. They create histories, they create potential future histories, they kind of recreate utopic pasts that never ever occurred, but it all kind of informs things. So I was kind of thinking, well, as artists, and that's why I think this is a really important quote for me. You know, as an artist, you know, how do we balance actual, whatever it is, actual history with the ones that we want to create and the ones we want to question? And, you know, and I think this is kind of interesting, this quote I found. History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree on. And does anybody know who this is by? It will surprise you all. Napoleon. It's just kind of, so, and, you know, if you think of history like, I suppose it's really like, how do you navigate these boundaries between artistic speculation, fictional history, and what is real history? And I really don't want to get anywhere close to what is real history, because it's a total rabbit hole that we'll never ever escape from. So I can't answer what is history. All I can say is there's quite a lot of like questions, like what is the responsibility of the artist retelling histories? And, you know, what is the balance between speculative history and whatever is considered factual history? And also there's other things that, I mean, I teach at the University of Creative Arts sometimes, and I rather than teach documentary filmmaking, I call it fact-based film. And I think that has quite a lot of, you know, the idea of documentary has that kind of BBC idea of verity and the truth, and it's really well researched, and it's definitely the way things are. Whereas fact-based, in a way, allows you to start from facts and then kind of move in whatever way you want. So, you know, I'm kind of saying, in a way, what are the differences between this concept of documentary and fact-based art? And then what is historic truth? And also the questions are, who gets to narrate it? I mean, I think it's a well-known fact, isn't it? History is written by the victors. And so there are so many other histories around. And I think it's kind of interesting because actually, when John was writing his book about Haiti, I think we had a bit of tension because John only wanted to base a lot of the book on what was actually, could be cited by written documents in archives. And for me, there was a class issue there, which was what was missing. It's the people's histories that can't go into those archives. So in a way, you know, like the percentage of people in Haiti that are literate is quite small. So what happens to all the other stories? So, but then there's other stuff, you know, and of course at this point in history, propaganda, they say truth is the first casualty of war. So, so what I'm saying is, I'm not saying any answers about history. All I can say, I think, is one thing I can say, history is not fixed. And I think it's really important as artists that we really think about that it's not fixed. And then therefore to kind of look at why the fluidity, like in a way, there was something about the Ghetto Biennale, it's about, did it bleed? And it's not so much a point of, does history bleed? It means it's where does it bleed? And how does it bleed? And where does it bleed out? And so I'd say it's funny, like I've been going on to students today, going, what is your artistic statement? So I had a look at my own. And I say, I scour back through time to unearth quasi-utopic pasts and depend on proxy histories from pre-grain societies, esoterical rituals, alchemic processes, collective bargaining, and revolutionary narratives. So these are all, in a way, different histories that don't get told, quite a lot of them. So in a way, I've been very, very interested, for me, in grassroots histories. And I would definitely say that Haiti is very much a place in Haiti, you know, like the education is not so good in Haiti, but you'd be hard pushed to find a single person in Haiti that doesn't know the absolute detailed facts of the revolutionary history in Haiti. You could be sitting on a mountaintop with a peasant with a hoe, and they would go through which revolutionary leaders they hated, they liked, they supported, every detail. So this is a history that is definitely from the grassroots up. And this is what is really, really interesting, what I love about Haiti, and what often I feel that we've lost here. So this first project is an early project I did in Haiti. I've been going to Haiti, maybe giving you my past. You might say, why would I have gone to Haiti? Was actually, nobody's heard of Jill Dando, though. I've run out of people, yet there's a few in the audience. So many years back, in 1991, I was the van driver for the Communist Party. So my van was parked outside with a red star on the front. It was snowing, I was feeling miserable, and it was the holiday program with this fabulous presenter, Jill Dando, who looked very like Lady Di, who just got mentioned. And she was in the Dominican Republic. And suddenly, and I was just sort of thinking, wow, look at the weather there. And suddenly she said, by the way, don't go to the other half of the island. It's got voodoo, black magic, dictatorship, military coups, death. And I remember going, wow, all that and hot weather. And, you know, and then, because I worked in the book distribution warehouse of the Communist Party, we had I didn't even know there had been a slaves revolt. I had no idea. And I started reading about the slaves revolt, the fact that Haiti is the only, you know, like nation where the slaves rose up and they fought against Napoleon and they won. That's why it's kind of funny to have the Napoleon quote at the beginning. So you have this incredible history, which is kind of, again, one of these silenced histories. And you can understand that because, and also you have this, you know, a country with such an incredible culture, and voodoo being, in my mind, a quite incredible religion, which has been so demonized. And I think the reason for that is, you imagine after the revolution, all the colonial forces, all their blood must have run cold. So what do you do if you want to undermine a political movement, undermine all the culture that underpins that, you know? And that's really interesting why voodoo is the one religion where people go, don't they put pins in dolls? But you know, you have a very similar African-American religion in Cuba called Santeria. You have Candomblé in Brazil, but none of those names have had loads of like Hollywood films made about them. So there is, you know, this real sort of like, you know, lens upon Haiti and upon, I think Haiti has become like a kind of, this kind of mythological epicenter of a lot of kind of racial anxiety in the world. So, and that makes it, of course, I think quite also for me as a representer, but not Haitian. Also, it's very kind of made it a very tricky situation at times, but I'm going to try and talk about how I kind of negotiate the situation. So, Carnival. Now, like I said, with this historical retelling, we felt mask after mask, and a mask normally hides stuff, but I'm going to explain how in this case, it reveals history. So this is one of the first photographs I took in 1995, and it was the first time I went to this carnival, and it's right in the south of Haiti. So it's a small town on the coast. It's not the main big carnival in the capital. And so I was like, I just went, and at first, you know, I was basically overcome by the spectacle of it already, these kind of incredible costumes. And I will kind of go backwards through them. So if you sort of think that like I'm thinking responsibly about Haiti and about the way in which quite a lot of negative stories of Haiti are relayed, a lot of them are through images. And so therefore, I suddenly thought, especially if you go back to this one, this image would sort of, like in a way, so easily feed into kind of a lot of anxieties around Haiti. You know, these guys blacker than black, because they kind of make their skin blacker with a mixture of like charcoal and cane syrup, you know, and these horns. But so I suddenly thought, I've kind of in a way got the signifier without the signified. No one, I don't, you know, like there's these really spectacular pictures, but what are the stories? You know, and I felt that there were actually very complex stories underneath these costumes. So I went back in a time when there was no carnival at all and got the stories. So these stories, these guys are called lancer cord, which means rope throwers. And you can just about see they're carrying ropes. And they're saying that, yeah, it's a reappropriation. We're carrying the ropes that used to bind us. And they represent the revolutionary Haitians. And they're like, now we hold the ropes and we hold the method of containing us. We hold that ourselves. And this guy, he's the Marron Inconnu, which is the runaway slave. So there's Maroons, which is in Jamaica as well. It's like slaves run away, and in Haiti, because it's so mountainous, they could kind of live in these kind of villages right up in the mountains. And so this is also a very strong symbol. And he's carrying a conch, which is the way in which people spoke to each other from mountaintop to mountaintop. And this is this is kind of very, you know, like this is a slave with like, you know, the colonial forces. I like this one. You can't quite see it, but the detail on the material is little kittens. And this is Grand Manger, the fat cats. So they also use in Carnival to like, you know, to critique the government and critique corruption in the government. And these two little lads, you know, they're kind of, you know, they're wearing the chains. And I like the idea that they've decided, you know, they've become faceless as, so, and I guess they obviously nicked their mum's wigs as well. So I kind of did this work, and then from 95, and then it's in 2010, so I kept going back every year. It got brought out by Soul Jazz Publishing, which mainly actually is a record company. And they kind of brought out a record, you know, like a kind of Haitian compilation CD at the same time. But what I found was really important that, you know, was that the oral histories were kind of on an equal weighting with the photographs, you know, and so that as a reader, you kind of got to hear all the stories. You know, you couldn't miss the stories. They weren't all at the back or kind of neatly easy to forget. They were kind of into, you know, like all the way through. So you kind of couldn't miss them, which is interesting because it's now just come out as a new book. And it's much more of a photography book. And the publisher then was, oh, let's put all the oral histories to the back. We are now just going to make a big thing about the photography. But it's, you know, these things happen. But so there was a show at New Art Exchange, and this is how it was laid out. And again, it was very important to me that the oral histories were on the walls next to the pictures. And then what we also did, this is Nottingham, is we met with a group of kind of a youth group in Nottingham, and we got them to record them reading out the oral histories. Because what I'm often trying to do as well is to de-other the work. So the work doesn't just become, wow, those Haitians, they're dead weird. It was like we had people reading out, and so from speakers inside the gallery, people with Nottingham accents were reading out the stories. So there's that sense, they could be our stories too. It's not necessarily just the weird other. So that's how. And then what we did was, my partner, who's an artist in Haiti, he brought some of these little things over. But then the other stuff is from, there's an artist called Jeremy Della. Has anybody heard of Jeremy Della? So he did this thing called the Folk Archive, where he kind of went around Britain collecting all this fantastic folk art. And we got permission to kind of go to the archive and take some of the work. So again, and it was Eugène, my partner, kind of chose work that he could find in that archive that kind of, for him, had a resonance with Haitian culture. And so in a way, yeah, again, it's trying to say, it's not all us and them, you know, that we, like we make strange velvet underpants for wrestlers, you know, which have a link with actual voodoo flags, kind of bizarrely. You know, we're quite capable of creating weird stuff ourselves. And you can see the relationship of that with the rest of the work. And then in a kind of screening, we screen quite a lot of films about British folk traditions. So for me, it's very important not just to put the work up. I think very, very carefully about screenings, about talks, about all the programming that goes around the work, because it contextualizes your work. I mean, I guess it's also because I'm a curator as well as an artist, so I do sort of think in that way. And, you know, and it makes it, I think, a much kind of, you know, like a better experience. We then showed the work in Birmingham, and Birmingham actually has its own carnival. So this is where it was shown in Birmingham. You see, there's a little kind of doorway to the left there. So what we did in this case is we invited the Birmingham Carnival Committee to use that room and actually exhibit their archive. So again, it's trying to say, you know, like to try and kind of enmesh things, not separate things. And then also what we did for the show the show in Birmingham is that we invited this sort of group that had a sort of scratch slam poetry night. And they came to see the exhibition, and then they came back and they'd all written kind of poems based on, you know, based on the works. So that was like, again, it was trying to get local people really interested and kind of interfacing with work. And then this is like the final thing is I was invited to take part in this exhibition called Al Masquerade in Germany. And it's interesting. So I've got you know, you can see I've got a style with these pictures. It's black and white. I use a very, very old fashioned camera. It's like the same age as me, won't tell you how much. And you know, but I use film, it's got 12 exposures. Every time you have to like cock the shutter, you have to do a separate light reading. But also I prowl around Haiti, but obviously now in Germany, looking for places where there's no cars. I have a car aversion. I think I'm trying to make the pictures quite timeless, I guess. So I was invited to go over and do some photographs of German carnival. And this is an alpine carnival, and it's always held in February. And but it's pretty cold at that point. So then, as you can see, they kind of showed them here in the gallery, but on the other side, they showed the Haitian work. So yeah, again, it's trying to bring these things in. It's to make comparisons, to kind of not to. I'm always trying to make sure that Haiti is not seen as this kind of exceptional place, this strange, bizarre place. So here we go, cast. So there was a colonialist called Moreau Saint-Marais, who was a French colonialist living in Haiti before the slaves revolt. And he became very obsessed with the kind of mixing of races, which kind of came out of the slave trade. And he kind of got obsessed with kind of naming everything. And we've got this great quote of a Haitian historian, Colin Diane, said, "Stranger than any supernatural fiction, the radical irrationality of Moreau Saint-Marais' methods demonstrates to what length the imagination can go if driven by racial prejudice." So he had his like almost like kind of very flowery language, and he started, you know, with black, and then would go like, you know, like 1/8 white, 8. I'm obviously not very good at maths, but you can work it out yourself. So there was Sakatra, Griffon, Marabout, Mulat. Mulat is very in the middle, and which means actually little mule. Mamelouk, Cotoronais, Sang Malay, which means mixed blood, and then Blanche. So in a way as well, what I kind of did is, that's Eugène, my partner. So I put him at one end as noir, and I used myself as a model at the other end as white. So in some ways, I thought it was kind of ironic that there I am, this white person working in Haiti, and ironically, this kind of very racist skin color classification was the one thing that kind of held me in the story. And, you know, and also I'm kind of looking at ways that I'm implicated in this history. And I don't know if you noticed, they're all based on very famous Renaissance paintings. Now, there's two reasons. you're not really allowed to say this in the art world, but I will say it, I just love Renaissance paintings. So in fact, actually, you know, like I do very badly if people, you know, like, Leah, will you write down, you know, the theoretical reason why you love Renaissance paintings? They're just gorgeous. But it is true at the same time, it's very rare to see a black face in a Renaissance painting, unless they're usually kneeling at somebody else's, you know, like holding a cushion or something like that. So, and I worked also very closely with a Haitian tailor who created all these costumes. And, you know, John knows him, his name is Jonas. And I think it's really interesting because all the models live in the same neighborhood as Eugène. So it is pretty much a slum neighborhood. And it's funny that everyone thinks that these places are totally de-skilled. But you would actually find the level of skills in these neighborhoods are just so high. And so there we go. And so you can kind of see it. It was shown at quite a few different places in different ways. This is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney in an exhibition called Taboo. This is in an exhibition in a museum in Florida, which was about actually the representation of Haiti. And this is a show that it's in now called Origin Stories. So, you know, this work has kind of traveled quite a lot. So it brings us to, so I'd finished that work in 2012, and then after that, I got kind of a grant from an organization in Brighton to kind of expand it. Now this is the civic badge of Ellesmere Port. So Ellesmere Port's where I'm born, and it's exactly halfway, it's on the Manchester Ship Canal, and exactly halfway between Manchester and Liverpool. I don't know if you know much about Manchester and Liverpool. Liverpool was, you know, they're both real, like, both capital cities, and they're both like, not capital cities, they're both like cities, and the fortunes of Liverpool is based on the slave trade, and the fortunes of Manchester is based on the Industrial Revolution. And there I am, well placed in between the two. And as you can see, even the badge of Ellesmere Port, you know, it's got the kind of cogwheel of industry on the sail of the kind of maritime boat. So it's really, even its own civic badge is kind of like really, you know, seeing where, you know, it's sort of like its roots are. So there's a booze cruise that goes from Manchester to Liverpool. And it's usually full of quite a lot of hen parties. And then there's a woman, God, I suppose even Cilla Black is too old. Anyway, I don't know if you've heard of Cilla Black. Anyway, she sounded very like Cilla Black, who's a famous Scouser. And she kind of gives this talk, and it's pretty good. Now it's 6 hours. This woman does not stop, you know, and she gives all these histories of, like, you know, like where you're going past. So I made a film that has her kind of very jocular, but also historical, like, voiceover. I mean, obviously I didn't make it last 6 hours because it would have been horrific. But it still was a bit too long, not far too long. It was made to just go into a gallery and not be, I would die if anybody actually sat down to watch it all. And then I had these kind of bridges of text where I was kind of looking at the, you know, like Britain pats itself on the back about abolition, you know, as if like, you know, look at Britain, we're so great, we abolished the slave trade first. But, you know, if you start reading, abolition is very, very complicated. And it was a lot of Manchester industrialists who favored the abolition because, in fact, actually there was a movement of capital, and they were realizing the capital was seeping away a bit in the plantation system in the Caribbean. So in fact, actually it was suiting capital to bring it back to Britain, you know, and so I found all these different quotes, and sort of as, you know, and this is a kind of, doing this research was when I kind of unearthed the Enclosure Act in a way. So this is kind of, hunger is not only a peaceable, silent, unremitted pressure, but is the most natural motive to industry and labor. You know, it's really interesting, Adam Smith, you know, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, he sort of was against slavery, but not because he thought it was brutal. his theory was that the whip was it was too expensive. It was too kind of like, it took too many people to do too much whipping. But if you actually created starvation of your own nation, and it's what the Enclosure Act to a certain extent created, there would be nothing else but to work in, because, you know, Karl Marx always said, what on earth made all these people go and work in these absolutely horrible factories? You know, they stank, it was horrible work, it was like so hot, you know, like the smoke coming out of them. Well, because they didn't have much choice really between hunger and starvation or work. And, you know, the pittance they got paid was probably cheaper than, you know, paying people to whip everybody into the factories every day. So you kind of realize that the world we live in now was based on these thoughts. These are, and these will all be middle class, very kind of respected philosophers who are all sitting around thinking, how do we force, yes, okay, we had slavery, but how do we force our own nation into a different kind of wage slavery? So, and it's true, the word factory actually comes from the slave trade. So tell me if I'm running over, because I can finish. So at the same time, when I was kind of working on this project, it was discovered that no one could ever find the Haitian Declaration of Independence. No one kind of actually found, you know, knew where the actual, well, there were quite a few at the time, but they'd all seemed to have disappeared. And a young PhD student from Duke University managed to track it down in the Kew archives. And the reason they didn't know it was there is somebody, a kind of British ambassador from Jamaica, had gone and taken a copy, and then it ended up in a Jamaican archive. But then it just got so embedded, nobody even knew it was there. So this young student found it in the Kew archives, and then, do you know what? It's disappeared. You cannot get to see it, you can't go anywhere near it. So the most that they allow me to do is to go in and film the corridors where it had been. So I kind of did this thing of like, the fact that it's kind of interesting to me that Haitian, such an important part of Haitian history, the Declaration of Independence, is kind of hidden in the depths of these Kew archives. And, you know, to this day, I have no idea actually where it is. These are just stills out of this kind of film. I shot it on 16mm. And then it's out of interest. I always knew there was this old machinery, actually just outside the little town, Jacmel, where the carnival is. And there was always like, I'd always kind of saw it because there was a mural on the wall in Jacmel, and it had a picture of this, and then it said Liverpool. And I was like, And so I kind of went to find it. And it's this incredible old beam engine made near Liverpool. See, and that's kind of funny. So you have part of the whole, you know, the British Industrial Revolution sinking into a kind of tropical, you know, like field in Haiti. So I kind of like, again, it's like these histories, all these histories aren't as separate as people would like them to be. It's not all very simple. You know, all these histories are so bound up together. And then this is, so like you can see, it was the Hay Ironworks, and this is Hay House, and this is the family that kind of, and they basically made their money in the Jamaican slave trade, then they pulled the money out and quickly flipped to kind of making machinery. And Annabelle did find it fantastic. Anyway, they kind of like introduced dogs to chase Jamaican slaves or something. And then, but the other nice thing is they're just outside Wigan, and also in Wigan is Wigan Casino, which used to be called the Empire Club, in fact. Sorry. And so we also, like, it's the same thing. I don't know if anybody knows what Northern Soul is. Well, John here is an excellent Northern Soul dancer. And Northern Soul was this sort of, people would go to the Wigan Casino and dance to kind of B-sides of Detroit soul records. And the dancing was really incredible, really brilliant. And then there was something of the kind of dancing, if you see it, that really reminds me of the dancing in voodoo ceremonies. And again, it's this thing that the dancing would just go on all night long, maybe with some help. But so I'm gonna, I think, this is a piece, an artwork that John did, and I think John can explain it afterwards. But I'm hoping we've got sound. No, it doesn't have sound at the beginning. John. I'm going to stop it there, but I'm sure John will let you see more of it. And I'm just going to actually just end here, even though there's loads more. But anyway, the final part is there's a book called Life in an 18th Century Slave Society by Stedman. And this book became very, very instrumental in the abolition of the slave trade. And the illustrations in the book were done by William Blake. I'm sure you've heard of William Blake. And this one is William Blake's, it's like based on the Three Muses. And what he's trying to say is that the kind of, there's Europe in the middle. It's called Europe Supported by Africa and the Americas. And he's trying to say that this kind of, the beautiful youth and wealth of Europe is totally supported by the labor of Africans and indigenous Indians. And this was always a really kind of important image for me. So I went on to do a reconstruction of it. But I kind of like this idea of a changing world where Europe is now decrepit and old. And so it was in a show. And I think what I'm going to do is just leave it there. I think.
You want to talk maybe about the monument to the vanquished?
Well, I can, but I just don't want to kind of go on for ages. I mean, do you want me to go on a little bit longer? Okay. Yeah. So I'm just going to go through that. Okay. So I will talk about this. So this is the project I'm doing with Meadow Arts. We are doing with Meadow Arts. And Albrecht Dürer, I don't know if he's like kind of a painter and also fantastic like line drawer, illustrator from Germany from, when? Yeah, 1600s. Yeah, I meant to look this up on the train. And he actually did this, it never got finished. He called it the Monument to the Vanquished Peasant. There was a peasants' revolt in Germany, and it failed. But the peasants they were kind of losing their rights to kind of graze, the common rights which were lost in Britain with the Enclosure Act. And he did this like sketch for a statue, which is kind of a monument to the vanquished peasants. And as you can see, the peasant's got like a sword in his back. And it's kind of interesting that it never ever was fulfilled. It never got made. And I guess in a way, that's why we call this project the Monument to the Vanquished, because we're kind of looking at ways, how can we monumentalize the Enclosure Act? It's really interesting. The Enclosure Act, once it happened, the Enclosure Act really was a set of acts in Parliament which took away peasants' rights to common land. And those rights would be to collect firewood, to graze their animals, all the small things that left their lives. They still probably would work for a landowner, but they would still have enough income or kind of sustenance to kind of keep their families alive and keep a couple of like cows or pigs and have somewhere to graze them. Now, once you take that away, you create starvation, the exact starvation that you need to actually get people to work in factories. So, but it's really interesting. There is, not one monument to the Enclosure Act, not one memory of this kind of brutality. There is only one monument to the Highland clearances in Scotland, which is kind of interesting as well. It's so I mean, and in this day and age about questions about what do we monumentalize and what histories do these monuments tell, I felt that this was kind of also very important. So first thing we started off is to root out commoners that still have common rights. And whilst actually, I wouldn't say they are commoners so much these days, I think it's very interesting to look at their rights, because it's almost like a snapshot back to the 17th century, like the rights to collect ferns and windberries. You just, and this is like a well, which it was kind of funny. It's vaguely kind of slight in somebody's bungalow back garden, but it's like the well actually is supposedly free access to everybody. Because it was on a drover's route, so people taking their sheep to market would have the right to water their sheep there, and this right still exists. So we took Grace there, because Grace actually does have her own flock of sheep. So she is a young farmer, but I don't suppose she's ever really watered them there. But and then this is Roy Griffiths. He's on Stapley Common. And he has the rights to bracken. And it was kind of interesting, because I did go, why would you want the rights to bracken? But he was saying that straw, there's been times when straw has been really expensive. And therefore, to be able to go up onto a common land and collect bracken would be really, really important. And what we did, I don't know if you kind of can see, there's a great theorist called, she's an Italian feminist Marxist theorist called Silvia Federici. And she looks at the link between witch hunts and the Enclosure Act. And she actually can see that there's a lot of witch hunts in Nigeria now. And of course, this is a time when there's a lot of land clearances and land grabs. And what she's theorizing is that these more matriarchal religions are more pagan and therefore have a deeper relationship to the land, and therefore are a threat to anybody that wants to start separating communities from the land. Because if you demonize the culture that underpins this relationship to the land, then you kind of demonize any politics around it. So it's exactly the same thing as voodoo. So what we kind of did was photograph them in black and white. And then I got a friend of mine who's like a fantastic painter, and she taught herself how to hand tint. So we tried to give everything a slightly magical air, which kind of in my way relates to a more spiritual and kind of religious relationship to the land. I kept saying to Marg, imagine you've taken a whole load of acid before you start painting them. But so they are all black and white and then hand painted. So, and this is how I kind of, at the moment, we've just shown them in Madrid. That's how they looked. And this was a big show about land. So, and we're going to move forwards. One is, you can see this picture, and you can see earlier that I kind of did a kind of reconstruction of it for something else. This is this amazing book by John Thomas Smith, who is a friend of William Blake's. And of course, another thing is vagabonds. In a way, once the Enclosure Act really kind of kicked in, you get a lot of people that actually didn't want, they refused to go and join, like the workforce in the factories. And it created a class of vagabonds. It created loads more crime than ever existed before. And John Thomas Smith went and sketched a lot of these kind of beggars and vagabonds in Whitechapel. And it's quite an amazing book. Oh yeah, that's just showing you the picture I kind of recreated for another project. And the rat catchers, that terriers are an outcome of the Enclosure Act, because they kind of had to kind of breed a small dog that was able to kill rats, because the rat population in the urban, everybody was leaving the countryside and living these really, really stressed conditions in, you know, in cities, and rats became like a really major problem. So like kind of that invented the little terrier dog. So we're kind of thinking of working with the community in Malvern and talking about this history, and then actually working with theatres, a theatre group, and trying to recreate some of these pictures. And I love this quote. It's a French writer. The law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. You know, and that's true. You can't say they're not equal. I mean, he's such a great guy. I love Alan. So then we're also going to look at rural rebellions, and I'm thinking I use this kind of technique of everything in this picture is a montage, and everything actually is photographed in on film, and then kind of paint. You know, so there's about like 300 layers in this picture. So I'm going to create some different montages that maybe tell the stories of rural rebellions. And then the final thing is the monument. And we're kind of looking at this idea. I did this project actually at the Outsider Art Fair in New York. I was a guest curator. And I think I was a guest curator because I know a lot about Haitian art. And they thought I was going to like drag in some, they, you know, would have loved it, some uneducated Haitian artist. And, you know, and I thought, no, I'm going to do something really different. And I knew nothing about 3D printing, but I put out a call, a global call, to send me 3D files. I knew so little about it. I don't even know the files' names actually, of towers. And we worked with a printer, 3D printer in Brooklyn, printed them all, and we exhibited the lot. And it made this kind of you know, it's kind of nice that it was in Manhattan, that it was shown. So we're thinking of putting out a call to say, what in your mind would be a monument to the vanquished peasants? What would be a monument to the Enclosure Act? How can you monumentalize it? And then we're going to put out a call and try to do the same thing, and then create a kind of huge, and it will be common, it will be a common project where everyone is allowed to kind of do whatever they want, and they'll all be exhibited together. And maybe there will be one perfect one, you know, it could be huge and represent it all. So I think I will stop there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Leah. I'm just going to grab a stool here so we can maybe just sit down for questions. Mm-hmm. If anybody has any questions who's watching the live stream, please do add them to the Q&A. And me and Leah will maybe have a few questions. Yeah. I mean, there's so much we could say, but I'll just ask you a few.
Maybe I should, I don't know. Shall I turn this off or leave it on? Doesn't make any difference, no?
You good?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm terrible on stools, though. Short people are terrible on stools. You always think you're going
to... The Valdunicans.
Yeah. You always feel like you're going to fall off.
Cool. Okay. Great. So I'm just going to... Okay, so when... Okay, just go from the back up.
Yeah.
Okay. Secret societies.
Okay. Yeah,
when you talked about the rural uprisings, you showed a lot of Freemasonic stuff.
I did, but it was only just to show the kind of the montage process rather than.
But in terms of rebellion and uprisings, how important do you think secret societies are?
I mean, it's a very good question, but one I'm possibly not quite equipped to answer. I mean, certainly, there's been a lot of secret societies in Haiti, and because they are quite secret. I don't know. I don't know if I'm really able to talk about that that well.
Because I think there are histories of esoteric underground sort of cult, secret brotherhoods that were part of the resistance of the poor towards the Enclosure Act.
I mean, maybe Annabelle will be better at this. I mean, there's Captain Swing, and there's quite a lot of kind of histories of.
And I think quite often the authorities thought that there was much more sort of a secret society. I mean, I know there were 3 people who were hanged who everyone thought had been in touch with other people all around the country, but actually they hadn't, because it was sort of more difficult to communicate, and in fact it was just sort of general uprising in different places because everybody felt the same way, and they maybe heard about it, but it was to sort of organise secret society.
But certainly, I mean, Annabelle was saying to me, the one thing was this idea that peasant revolts and that all the peasants were quite lumpen. You know, a lot of the peasant revolts were quoting Piers Plowman.
But yes, I was also that
Yeah.
the actual peasant revolt in the 14th century, they did communicate with various people who wrote letters.
Maybe Annabelle should come up.
No, because sorry, you're not to say.
Okay.
They wrote, you know, a sort of series of letters that were sent round. So in that sense, yes, there were sort of secret communications for that, and they were, everyone said, oh, the literate peasants, but actually they weren't. They had a sort of culture, and when they went and ransacked the monasteries and all the law courts and stuff, they were especially destroying the paper records, which were making their lives much worse, which were the records of the taxes they had to pay and punishments that should have and all the rest of it. So there's actually a sort of
really targeted.
Targeted destruction of records.
Right. Thanks. I want to go back to the sort of 90s again, and this relationship. So, because I never really knew, you know, what was it that why did you bring Voodoo Nation? Why did you bring the troupe to the night spot?
Yeah, I mean, my problem is it's never quite as, you know, it was, I'm quite, okay, there's a guy that had brought the first Cuban band to London. He's like, you know, basically a music promoter. I think he brought, the Cuban All-Stars over. And I knew he was going to go to Haiti. And really, basically, I wanted a bit of it. And I know that how nervous people get when they go to Haiti the first time. So I actually flew out there 2 days before him. I went, oh, by coincidence, I'm going to be there, but it wasn't coincidence. So I said, I can meet you at the airport. And, you know, of course, he's like, phew, thank God, it'd be so scary. You know, he probably had heard Jill Dando. So I kind of steered him away from a lot of these there was a lot of bands doing this kind of roots music, which sounded a bit like Santana. And said, look, why don't you really think about bringing actually a voodoo group over? Because I just felt that it would be much more exciting. And I sort of said, look, think of the rave culture, you know, goes on all night. You know, you go into a trance mode. It's exactly the same as voodoo. A voodoo ceremony goes on for 8 to 11 hours. You go into a trance mode. You know, the drumming is kind of very, very hypnotic. So I kind of got there and kind of, you know, over a few beers, influenced him. Oh God, I hope he's not watching. So yeah, it was that really. I mean, I kind of just felt that this was also a really good way, because voodoo is so demonized, this was an ideal way of kind of bringing voodoo into kind of, rather than it be put on at like some sort of ethnographic kind of folkloric dance place where you would like make voodoo into like a 2 half-an-hour slots with like, you know, a break in an interval where they'd all be dancing around. This was, I felt, a really good way of making quite a lot of kind of links between popular culture and voodoo, and allowing the voodoo to be a bit more like it is. So we were at Cream in Liverpool, and I can't remember the name of the place. What was it called?
Was it some Good Shed or something?
And so we had a Haitian band called Bootman Experience playing in another room, and we had this great DJ who was like playing a lot of Caribbean music, but he had a line coming from the voodoo and the drumming, and every now and then he would kind of mix in the drumming with whatever he was playing. And so we had the kind of whole nightclub. But you know, we had demonstrations outside both venues. Demonstrations had to be moved by police of Christians saying that, handing out leaflets saying, if you become possessed and by the devil, you can come to us and we can. They were actually offering their services to you know, like you phone this number. What's the word? You know,
helpline.
Yeah, they kind of
Save Your
like
Soul.
saveyoursoul.com. Well, no, the .com didn't exist. But anyway, so, you know, it was, you know, it wasn't without its problems. And it was very funny. The Haitians obviously got infected by Liverpool. So it was great because they went on strike in Liverpool. And they went, oh, brilliant. So you're getting infected by British culture as well. They were in Liverpool. They did a walkout. And then the promoters, the Haitians, they wanted more money. No, they wanted money in their pockets. Because basically the British embassy had said they will only give them visas if they only get paid when they get back to Haiti. And then they kind of went, we want money to spend now. We're in England. And it was kind of funny because they walked out and we were all in the car park and the promoter was going, here I am in Liverpool in a car park, because in Liverpool all strikers go out and then the boss has to negotiate in the car park. He goes, God almighty, I've become one of the bosses. So that was quite funny.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Great, because there's a current that runs through that I keep picking up on, like, which is like underground resistance, like this techno. There is this Black Atlantic deep connection to the Middle Passage, to the rhythms of Africa, that it like pulses through underground culture in the UK and has done for a long time. And it also led to Castle Morton in a certain sense. So it's just the Castle Morton. Do you want to say something about what happened at Castle Morton? Or?
Well, I was just thinking that maybe you want to say a little bit about your piece of work, because I think it relates to that. You know, the one that we just saw first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just a little bit about that piece of work. I made that piece with my colleague
Robert. You have to explain the Veve.
Robert N. Perry. Okay. Am I coming through all right on the? Okay. So just a quick story. I was at the Ghetto Biennale #1 in 2009, and my friend, colleague, I'd known him, Robert N. Perry, was there, and we both realized that part of the reason we were in Haiti was to experience a voodoo ceremony or to be around voodoo ceremonials. And what we both recognized was the dance floor. The voodoo ceremony is a dance floor. It's an incredibly choreographed, complex set of dances that have different rhythms. So they're very specific dances and movements to specific rhythms. So we were drawing out the parallels between our experiences on Northern Soul dance floors, dancing all night in a kind of trance-like state. And this very interesting thing that in Northern Soul, there's a lot of acrobatics, which are quite dramatic, based on martial arts moves. And this link between fighting and dancing is really crucial. And you see it a lot in voodoo. There's really like, well, if someone gets possessed, they get a sword out and they go around. Like if Ogun turns up, you know, the sword is out and you better watch out, right? So, and Ogun, when he gets possessed, whoever gets possessed by Ogun, because Ogun could possess a man or a woman. The spirits don't care what sex you are.
Yeah.
And so whoever gets possessed,
blind.
they're gender blind. But what happens is this incredible ritual. It's hard to work out how it's like ritualistically performed, and there are moves, but it's also wild, right? So you really don't, you kind of like, whoa, someone could really get hurt here. And people fly around the place, but somehow no one really gets hurt, right? Because everyone somehow gets it. Like there's a mind on the dance floor, which is also like the mind on the Northern Soul dance floor. In Northern Soul, traditionally, people use talcum on the floor to dance because it means you can spin really fast. So it smoothens the dance floor. In Haiti, they use corn flour to draw things called veves, which are basically signatures of the spirits, which attract the spirits. So if you want a particular loa to come to your ceremony, you draw a particular drawing on the ground, and that will summon them. So we did a piece, we invented our own spirit called Bamba Moira, which I won't go too far into, and we developed our own, what's actually called a ponto, which is from the Kimbanda tradition of Cuban religious tradition. And we did this performance. And so that's what it's, we was trying to draw parallels between, Black Atlantic, transcultural, British, and actually European underground dance culture and the traditions of voodoo and Central American, Caribbean religious practices to try and say that's, well, we've been doing it for a long time.
Well, when I first saw it, I mean, for me, like it just really like chimed with everything I've been trying to do, but in a slightly more trendy way, because I can't dance like that. So yeah, no, it was brilliant. So what you were asking me, this Castle Morton, well, I was like, I don't know why I've gone all blank. Well, I mean, what we were kind of looking at, if we kind of look at the vagabond issue, in a way, what you have is a kind of rural dispossession where people are kind of flooding into the city. And I think that what you had with Castle Morton Common, see how Annabelle and I met, well, no, we met years before, but how we kind of bonded our friendship is Annabelle was writing a book about the New Age travelers in the 90s. And I suddenly went, can I tag along, you know, in your camper van at the time? And then we traveled around and I started taking some photographs. So kind of like it was all happening then. And I would say that Castle Morton Common, to a certain extent, is a reversal of that dispossession. You've got, you know, we've just been through like Thatcher's government, you know, like life is 1,000 times harder in the cities. And you have basically the urban dispossessed. Mm-hmm. And the urban dispossessed are looking for something else, trying to find some other way of living. And, you know, that that was traveling around, but culminated in this big rave at Castle Morton Common, which is quite close to here. And it's the 30th anniversary next year, which of course, you know, like everybody was horrified. It was so huge. And then that basically culminated in a really draconian change in law about traveling, about nomadism, about being able to try to travel around freely around this country. And at the same time, you know, you look back to the days of the Enclosure Acts, the same thing, this draconian relationship between the movement of the lower classes. And so I think for me, that's what's very important. And we want to definitely bring that into the project.
Right. Cheers, Leah. Thanks. Okay. Do you have any questions from the in-house audience? Don't be shy. Yeah, question at the back.
I understand that you obviously have a really great respect for the Haitian culture and stuff, but how do you avoid or perhaps reflect on having that sort of English or fetishistic or colonizer perspective when shooting a culture that isn't yours?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in a way you can't ever avoid that. You can't change that. I think awareness is the only thing you can have. It really is. You can't kind of like negotiate your way out of this. I mean, so I would say there are strategies, like I showed you, there are strategies in the way in which I present the work in this country. So I think very, very carefully about how it's presented. And I think the other part of it is that I speak Creole. So that really does make a huge difference. You know, I can actually speak to everybody. And, you know, and also in some ways, I think the camera, I mean, this sounds a really weird answer, but the camera I use is part of a kind of, in a way, an erosion of the power dynamic. Because, you know, if you're using like a single lens reflex camera with a really long lens and you're doing this, you can basically hide behind corners almost and take photographs. But I'm using this camera, which you can't keep standing a real big distance away. You actually have to go up to the person and say, and speak to them in Creole, explain what you're doing, tell them what your project is. I pay everybody for the photographs. And in a way, there's a reciprocity as well, because in fact, there's a kind of the amount of time that this all takes, and I have to do a light reading, a fiddle, and then they can actually set their pose and in a way, you know, like pose themselves in the way that they want to be. So certainly I can't make that disappear. I cannot make the power dynamics of being a representer, even in itself. I mean, a representer that is Haitian will still have a power dynamic with a poor Haitian that hasn't got a camera. And my power dynamic is even bigger. But I think it's kind of just to keep aware of it. But yeah, it could never, ever disappear it. And I wouldn't even try to.
Thanks, Leah. Any other questions from the, yeah, please.
What drew you to Haiti in the first place?
Well, like I said, it was the BBC travel program telling me not to go. and I can't, you know, like once I started reading, like the fact that there was a slaves revolt, and I'd never heard that in a history lesson. Also, it was a bit bizarre. When I was 8 years old, I did start a voodoo club, which is kind of odd, because I don't know where that came from. It must have come from some like Hollywood film I'd seen. So when I found that was the home of voodoo as well, and it had the slaves revolt, you know, I don't know, it just became, I don't know, I just became compelled to go. So after I handed in my notice after like 1 week of watching that holiday program, worked 3 weeks more, and then I just took a plane to Haiti. So yeah, who knows? There is a voodoo priest that goes, I was the one that made you start the voodoo club when you were 8. But, you know.
It's true that voodoo, we have the same thing. Voodoo comes to us, even if it comes to us from a stereotypical dodgy movie, Hollywood movie.
Yeah.
We learnt about the Loire. We learnt about Baron Samedi. In a certain sense, the Loire did, in a way, move through popular culture.
No, I think it's absolutely true. Certainly Baron Samedi moves through popular culture very easily. I mean, from Live and Let Die, he's in a Blondie video, you know, there's no end to kind of the popular culture Baron Samedi has popped up in. So.
Great. Cool. Do we have any questions from the online
Yes,
audience?
we do. But one is more of a statement, thanking you, and another one is a question. So Charlotte Hammond says, really enjoyed the talk, Leah. Thank you. They're watching with their Wigan mug. They've got to go now, but they can't wait to see how your project unfolds. So thank you, Charlotte. And then we've got another one, an anonymous attendee is just asking you, why did you ask for towers? They just want you to, they're just wondering about towers.
It's a good question, actually, because funny enough, just this morning when I was thinking about my talk, I was like, I can't give any reason. It's a bit like, why did I Renaissance portraiture? I actually quite like towers. I've been photographing like air traffic control towers. And towers kind of interest me because there's some, you know, the panoptic view, the fact that towers are kind of symbols of power and of course of observation and of the way in which you survey the land. But also towers can be quite a positive thing. I've been having paintings done of drill towers in fire, fire stations have those towers at the back where they practice running up and down stairs. And I've been photographing them and sending the photographs to a Haitian painter who paints them for me because he has no idea how drab Britain is. So he does, all these resplendent, beautiful colors. So yeah, so towers have been something that I was interested in seeing what sort of towers came out of this project. We also had a prize. So there was a £1,000 prize for the best tower.
And you did the bells too, which are in towers.
That's right. Yeah, the bells are a big thing for me as well. The bells are like a very old form of communication with lots of people, and they come from towers. So yeah, so I've been photographing bells. So yeah, towers are a bit of a thing. Okay, great.
We're good?
Cool, yes.
Great. Thanks so much, Leah.
Thank you very much, everybody.
And thanks, Anthony.
Yeah, and thanks, Leanne.
Thanks, Leanne.